A former special agent, Brian lived alone because his only daughter chose to live with his ex-wife. One day, Brian visited his daughter's 17th birthday party. There, Brian met his ex-wife, Lenore, and not long after, Kim, Brian's daughter, came to welcome her father. Brian gave Kim a karaoke device as a gift because he knew that his daughter really liked singing. Then a man came, bringing a horse as a birthday present for Kim. That man was Kim's stepfather, Lenore's husband. Here, Brian looked a little disappointed because Kim preferred the present from her stepfather, while the gift he gave her was left. However, Brian would still love Kim, no matter what. That evening when he's home, Brian looked at Kim's photo. He was happy because his daughter was now 17 years old. But suddenly, Brian's friends came because they also wanted to celebrate Kim's birthday. When Brian's friends came home, one of his friends, Sam, offered Brian a job as a bodyguard for the famous singer. Brian was starting to get bored of being unemployed, so he agreed to the offer. Shortly, Brian and his friends started to work as bodyguards for a famous singer named Shira. When Shira was doing her vocal warm-up while doing the makeup, Brian felt so amazed by her voice. And when Shira was about to go to the stage, Brian asked her if there was any advice for his daughter, who also wanted to be a famous singer. Shira only said that Brian's daughter had to do a lot of practice. While waiting for the concert to end, Brian and his friends were enjoying playing cards, but suddenly Brian got a call from Kim, asking him to have lunch tomorrow at a cafe. Of course, Brian was very happy to accept the invitation. Long story short, after the concert was over, there was a riot because Shira's fans forced their way through the fence. Even when Brian tried to take Shira to the car, one of the haters wanted to stab her. Luckily, Brian managed to protect Shira. Feeling owed to Brian, Shira gave her card and allowed his daughter to take free vocal lessons, and she herself would train Brian's daughter. The next day, Brian was already at the cafe having lunch with Kim. That day, Kim also invited her mother. Here, Kim's purpose was apparently to ask permission from her father because she was going to Paris with her friend Amanda. Kim needed Brian's signature because she was not yet 18 years old. However, Brian had experience with the harsh world outside and thought that it was very dangerous for his child. Therefore, he refused to sign the permission letter. But this was in conflict with Lenore, who thought that Brian was too restrictive about his daughter's wishes. Kim, who was annoyed, immediately left the place. Brian didn't want his daughter to be sad, so the next day he finally gave in and signed the permission letter, but with the condition that Kim had to always activate her cell phone so that Brian could contact her. Shortly, when Brian took Kim to the airport, he found out that Kim had not only visited Paris, but had taken part in a music concert around Europe, and Lenore already knew it. But Lenore deliberately told Kim to lie to Brian because she knew that Brian was overprotective. Not wanting to disappoint his daughter, Brian finally let Kim go with her friend Amanda. Long story short, when Kim and Amanda arrived in Paris, they met a local young man named Peter. He was very friendly and was willing to take a photo of them. Not only that, Peter was also willing to be in the same taxi as them because their destination happened to be the same. When Kim and Amanda arrived at the hotel, Peter said goodbye to them. In the room, Kim and Amanda turned on the music loudly, and this made Kim couldn't hear incoming calls from Brian. When Kim found out that her father was calling, she immediately went to the next room. Kim said that she was fine, but at that moment, some strange men came in and immediately attacked Amanda. Seeing this, Kim felt very scared. Brian, who knew that her daughter was in danger, tried to stay calm and record all the conversations, because he knew that they would still catch Kim. Brian told Kim to go under the bed, then shouted the characteristics of the person who would catch her. When Kim was caught, she shouted that the person had a mustache, was 6 feet tall, and had a moon and star tattoo on his hand. When the perpetrators held Kim's cell phone, Brian said that he didn't know who they were. However, Brian would certainly chase them and finish them without mercy. But the person instead said, "Good luck." Brian immediately rushed to Lenore's house. On the way, he called his friend, Sam, to look for the identity of the perpetrators by sending a recording of the conversation. When Brian arrived at Lenore's house, he immediately went to Kim's room to look for some clues. At the same time, Sam called him, saying that the people who kidnapped Kim were the women trafficking syndicates. The victims who had been kidnapped would become a drug addict and then trafficked to mshorror to make money for them. The person with the characteristics mentioned by Kim was known to be someone named Marco, and if Kim was not saved within 96 hours, Kim would never come back. Hearing this made Lenore regret because she had let her daughter go. Not wanting to waste time, Brian immediately rushed to Paris. Arriving there, Brian immediately went to the crime scene, the hotel where Kim was kidnapped. Brian tried to think clearly by analyzing and carrying out simulations to come up with a hypothesis about what happened. There, Brian found Kim's cell phone, which had been destroyed by the kidnappers, so Brian immediately took the memory card to look for clues. When he checked the card, he found a photo of Peter at the reflection of the glass when Peter photographed Amanda and Kim at the airport. Brian then rushed to the airport to find Peter, because he suspected that Peter was an accomplice of the criminals. And sure enough, Peter was bait to look for victims and find out where they were staying. Brian managed to find Peter, so he immediately asked where Kim and Amanda were now, but unfortunately, Peter's friend tried to help him. Brian kept chasing Peter, who was trying to escape. Here, Peter pretended to be cool by doing parkour, but instead got hit by a car. Therefore, Brian's only clue has now gone. Brian, who was confused, finally met his old friend Jean. He worked as a French special agent in the Paris police department. After talking a lot, Jean said that the person who Brian was targeting was a very dangerous gangster from Albania. But Jean already knew how Brian dealt with criminals, so he just asked Brian not to cause trouble in Paris and just hand the case over to him. However, Brian didn't want to, because this was his daughter who was being kidnapped. Even though he had to bring down the Eiffel Tower to save his daughter, he was still going to do it. After that, with a little information from Jean, Brian went to a brothel and pretended to be one of the customers. When Brian opened the curtains one by one, he accidentally found Kim's jacket. Brian then asked the woman there where she got the jacket. But suddenly, the gangsters realized that Brian was an intruder and a commotion happened. Brian took the woman away, hoping that the woman would have a clue regarding Kim. In an apartment, Brian tried to treat the woman because she was still affected by the drugs. Jean found out that Brian was causing trouble, so he asked Brian to surrender himself and he would take Brian to the airport to immediately return to America. But of course, Brian won't do this because his daughter was still not saved. The next day, the woman who was being treated by Brian woke up. Brian asked her again how Kim's jacket was with her. The woman answered that she got the jacket from a woman who was very kind to her. She also gave Brian a little information that the police were also involved. From this information, Brian went to a place, claiming to be Jin's subordinate. Turns out, all this time they had given security fees to the local police. Brian pretended to be a police representative who wanted to raise the fees, and when Brian met them, he continued to analyze the situation. Brian asked where Marco was, but they answered that they were all Marco. Brian, who was already suspicious of one of the people with the characteristics mentioned by Kim, asked the person to say good luck with the Albanian writing. Brian realized that the man was the person who talked to him by phone. After killing the people there, Brian checked every room to look for Kim. Brian found Amanda, Kim's friend, who was now dead because of a drug overdose. After that, Brian took the person he suspected to be interrogated. He tortured the man very cruelly, asking where Kim was. Because unable to withstand the torture, the man said one name, St. Clair. Because Kim was still a virgin, they gave her to their boss, St. Clair. But unfortunately, that man didn't know where St. Clair was now. After getting the information, Brian immediately met Jean to find out about St. Clair. However, when Brian met Jean suddenly pointed a gun at him, asking Brian to surrender. But the gun bullets were empty because Brian had taken the bullets before the dinner started. Jean still didn't want to say who St. Clair was, so Brian was forced to shoot the gun into Jean's wife's arm. Jean didn't want his family to be the target of Brian's anger. In the end, he was willing to give information about St. Clair. After getting the information in detail, Brian immediately rushed to St. Clair's place and disguised as one of the guests. Brian entered one of the rooms, and it was an auction place for selected girls who would be sold to rich people. After seeing several girls there, Brian was very surprised because one of the girls was Kim, his beloved daughter. Brian immediately pointed a gun at one of the people there for taking Kim. But when Brian took the person, suddenly St. Clair's man hit him, making him unconscious. Shortly, when Brian woke up, he had been tied up and was hung from a pipe. Here, St. Clair said that all this was just a business. St. Clair ordered his men to finish off Brian without making any noise, because they had a lot of guests. Luckily, Brian was able to free himself, then beat them back. After that, Brian asked St. Clair where his daughter was now. Getting shot several times, St. Clair gave up and finally said that Kim would be taken on a ship to the Middle East. Quickly, Brian immediately chased the ship, stealing one of the cars. When he got there, Brian immediately infiltrated the ship and killed all the guards. With his skills as a former best agent, Brian didn't have too much trouble knocking them all out. In the end, Brian managed to find Kim, who was being held hostage by an old man. And without thinking twice, Brian immediately killed the old man. Kim cried and hugged her father. Here she just realized that disobeying her father is a bad thing. After Brian and Kim returned to America, Kim was immediately greeted by Lenore and her stepfather. Lenore was very grateful to Brian for saving Kim. 1 week later, the families were burying the people who had previously been massacred by Brian. An old man named Murad was the leader of the mafia in Albania. He asked all his subordinates to avenge the death of their family. Meanwhile, Brian was visiting Lenore's house to meet his daughter. That day, they had agreed to learn to drive a car, but Brian only met his ex-wife. Lenore said Kim was going to her boyfriend's house. Lenore then asked Brian not to track and spy on them, because since the kidnapping incident in Paris, Brian had become increasingly overprotective. Kim was with her boyfriend Jimmy, but suddenly Brian came. Brian said to Jimmy that he would pick his daughter up because he would teach Kim to drive. On the way, Kim was a little annoyed because her father was always overprotective of her. After Kim came home, Brian asked his friend, Sam, to find out Jimmy's background information. Sam worked at the security agency and had access to police data. That night in Paris, Murad's men were torturing Jin. They asked who the person who massacred their family was. They threatened to kill Jin's child if he didn't tell them who they were targeting. The next day, Brian returned to Lenore's house to meet Kim. There, Brian saw Lenore upset because she had a fight with her husband. Lenore said that her husband had changed and often behaved rudely towards her. Brian then invited Lenore and Kim to come along with him, going to Istanbul. Brian had a job there as a special bodyguard for officials for a few days, but Lenore refused because she didn't want to disturb Brian's work. On the other hand, Murad and the mafias got news that Brian would be in Istanbul for a few days. Long story short, after several days of work, Brian finally finished his job as a bodyguard, and he got quite good fees. But at that time, Lenore and Kim followed him for a holiday in Turkey. Of course, Brian was very happy with their arrival. On the other hand, Murad and his men started to enter the Turkish border to look for Brian, while Brian and his family went for a walk, having fun there. The next day, Murad's men were already at the hotel where Brian's family was staying. Brian, who was always alert, was suspicious of one of the people who was in the hotel lobby, but he ignored it and focused more on his family. Kim felt tired, so she chose to swim in the hotel pool while Brian and Lenore were hanging out together. Kim did this so that her father and mother could improve their relationship. While on the way, Brian realized that they were being followed by a group of people. Brian told Lenore to get off and go back to the hotel, picking up Kim and taking her to the American embassy so they would be safe. Brian then tried to lure them out, so they wouldn't endanger his family. Unfortunately, Brian's car was cornered. When the mafia opened the car door, it turned out that Brian had managed to escape. But in the end, Brian still had to fight with them. Brian managed to paralyze some of Murad's men. Actually, Brian could have killed them all, but unfortunately, Lenore was already caught. Realizing that Lenore and Kim would be kidnapped, Brian immediately called Kim and asked her to hide in Brian's bedroom wardrobe, because Kim would definitely be their target. After Brian surrendered, they immediately beat him and took him and Lenore to meet their leader, Murad. Even though his head was covered by a cloth, Brian remained focused on calculating the distance traveled and analyzing his surroundings through his hearing. Kim realized that she was going to be kidnapped and tried to enter her father's room to hide in a cupboard. Brian was held captive in an empty warehouse with a guard waiting outside. Brian then took out a special communication device in his sock. It was a normal thing for Brian as a special agent. He tried to contact Kim and tell her to immediately go to the embassy to make herself safer. But Kim refused and asked Brian to give her a chance to save her parents. Finally, Brian told Kim to take out a map that was in his suitcase. Brian told Kim to make a circle to find out where Brian was being held. Then he ordered Kim to throw a grenade in his suitcase to make a mark. After successfully analyzing it, Brian again told Kim to immediately leave there and get closer to where Brian was. Then suddenly, the head of the mafia, Murad, came and said that Brian definitely remembered the person he had killed by electrocuting him. That man was Murad's son, and now Brian would feel what he felt. Lenore was brutally tortured, left hanging to bleed out within 30 minutes. They deliberately did that so that Brian would be tortured before he could be completely finished off. After they left, Brian tried to untie the ties on his hands. Luckily, the ties were not made of iron, but only made of nylon, so Brian could easily untie them. Brian then immediately released Lenore. While Kim was already near the location where her father was being held, Kim finally reconnected with Brian. Here, Brian immediately told Kim to make another sign by exploding a grenade. Feeling that Kim was close to where he was being held, Brian then made smoke so that Kim knew which room her parents were in. Kim threw a gun in there, and Brian asked Lenore to survive. He would come back after slaughtering Murad's men. With his special agent tactical skills, Brian succeeded in slaughtering them one by one. On the other hand, Kim was chased by Murad's men because she was caught by them. In the end, Kim was cornered, but when she was about to be finished off, suddenly Brian saved her. After that, they were going to save Lenore, but unfortunately she had been taken by Murad's gang, and a very fierce chase ensued. Even though Kim was still learning to drive, she managed to knock over the gangster's car that was chasing her. Kim also managed to trick another car that was still chasing her. They broke into the American embassy, and Brian tried to contact Sam to immediately call his acquaintance who worked at the embassy. Brian felt that Kim was safe and said that he would come back to save Lenore. Brian tried to analyze again by remembering the first time he was kidnapped. While Lenore was being intimidated by Murad, it was seen that Murad's men had prepared some tools for torturing Lenore. At the same time, Brian continued to try to find Lenore, remembering everything he previously heard in the car when he was kidnapped. In the end, Brian managed to find the location. After killing the guards outside, Brian got in, attacking the people there. Murad realized that Brian was coming, so he planned to move Lenore to another place, but Brian still tried to save Lenore by killing all of Murad's men. Brian also had to face Murad's right-hand man, who was tough enough. Unfortunately, Brian was cornered. However, because he was stronger, Brian managed to finish off the guy. After that, Brian looked for Murad. When they met, Brian actually wanted to forgive him because if he finished Murad, his men would take revenge and return to targeting Brian. So Brian gave Murad a chance to live by putting his gun down as a sign of peace. At that time, Murad agreed to the peace, but when Brian turned around, Murad instead took the gun to finish off Brian. But it turned out that Brian had previously taken off the bullets from the gun. Brian thought that Murad was ungrateful, so he finally killed Murad. 3 weeks later after the incident, Brian was waiting for Kim to take her driving test. Kim finally succeeded in taking the test perfectly and got a driver's license. 2 years later, a group of Russian mafia were holding a man named Edo as hostage. The leader of the Russian mafia group was Oleg Malenkov. Oleg asked Edo to open the safe in the office because Edo's boss had a huge debt to Oleg. But when the safe was opened, there was not a single cent of money kept there. Because of that, they immediately finished Edo. In another place, Kim just found out that she was pregnant with her boyfriend Jimmy. But Kim was suddenly surprised by the arrival of her father. Brian came there with a doll for Kim's birthday, even though her birthday was still for quite a long time. Kim and Jimmy already lived together in the same house. That evening, Lenore visited Brian at his apartment. She came there because she wanted to talk about her husband, who had changed. Lenore was a little sorry about why she left Brian. The next night, Lenore's husband, Stuart, also came to Brian's apartment. He begged Brian not to see Lenore anymore because, after all, Brian and Lenore had now separated. Brian felt bad and finally agreed to Stuart's request. The next morning, Brian was jogging but suddenly got a message from Lenore, informing that she was currently at Brian's apartment. Lenore asked Brian to buy her some bread. Brian then went to buy some bread for Lenore. However, when Brian arrived at his apartment, he saw Lenore lying stiffly on his bed. Not long after that, the police came to arrest Brian. There was someone who was trapping Brian. Feeling sad and confused, Brian tried to stay calm. He thought that he had to find out about all this case, so he was forced to knock out the police who wanted to arrest him. Brian tried to avoid all the police who chased him, and he entered a warehouse then escaped through a drain hole. Because of that, Brian has now become a fugitive. Brian then contacted Kim, telling her that her mother had died and he was framed for her death. Brian asked Kim to stay calm and be strong. He also promised that he would find out who was the mastermind behind this murder. Meanwhile, an intelligent detective named Dotzler was the person responsible for solving the case of Lenore's death. He ate a piece of bread that was brought by Brian to look for the detailed clues. Brian realized that currently he's a fugitive. He called his friend Sam to ask about their secret base because Brian would start looking for the person who killed Lenore in his own way. At the same time, Dotzler tried to interrogate Stuart, who at that time had just arrived in town. He looked very sad and couldn't believe his wife's death. Stuart and Dotzler saw Lenore's body, which was kept in a morgue. There, Dotzler asked about Lenore's ex-husband Brian. Stuart said that Brian was a good person, but he also knew that Brian had many enemies, and he was involved in cases in Paris and in Turkey. Most likely it has something to do with Brian's enemies. Because he still hadn't found any clues, Dotzler asked his men to stay focused on catching Brian and keeping an eye on Kim. He also ordered 2 of his men to immediately download Lenore's car GPS, so that they could find out where Lenore was driving her car. However, Brian was already there to download Lenore's car GPS as well. After that, Brian was finally found out the last location Lenore visited. It was a gas station which was very far from the city. Brian came there to look for clues, claiming to be a police officer. From the CCTV footage, Brian saw that night, Lenore was kidnapped by a group of people. Suddenly, 2 police officers, Dotzler's men, also came there and immediately pointed a gun at Brian. But Brian ignored them and remained focused on looking for clues until he managed to find out that one of the kidnappers was wearing a tattoo on his hand. As a result, those 2 police officers easily caught Brian. On the way, the police were happy to tell Dotzler that they had caught Brian. They also thought that Brian wasn't as tough as what people said, but Dotzler asked them to stop and wait for him to come there, because Brian couldn't just give himself up. The police officers thought Dotzler was excessive, so they ignored his order and would still take Brian to the police office. But sure enough, Brian took out a handcuff key that he had prepared before. After successfully opening the handcuff, a commotion happened because Brian wanted to take over driving the car, and in the end Brian managed to escape. Brian then contacted Dotzler, asking him to give him 2 days, and he was going to reveal and prove that he was not Lenore's murderer. But Dotzler answered that he would still hunt down Brian because only the judge had the right to determine whether Brian was guilty or not. But Brian only said good luck. The police finally found out that Lenore was kidnapped that night by a group of people, which means that Brian was not the perpetrator. Brian then went to his secret base, meeting Sam. As Brian's best friend, Sam would not just let Brian face his problems alone. The next day, Lenore's funeral was held. Dotzler and his men watched Kim's movements and still wanted to catch Brian. At the funeral, Sam was there and told Kim that Brian asked Kim to do her predictable schedule because Brian would meet her. The next day, Dotzler asked his men to be ready because now, Brian must be meeting Kim. That time, Kim met her father in her campus toilet. Kim told her father that she was currently pregnant, which suddenly made Brian even more sad because if Lenore was still around, she would of course be very happy. Kim also told Brian that Stuart was now acting strangely and was always accompanied by his bodyguards. Not long after, Dotzler and his group came, determined to enter the women's toilet. But they couldn't find Brian because he had already run away. Realizing that Brian was still in the area, Dotzler and his men continued to look for Brian. Brian blamed the small explosive which made the campus alarm sound and released water, so that all the students scattered out, and again, Brian managed to escape. The next day, Stuart was leaving the city accompanied by his men. While on the way, it turned out that Brian was following Stuart, but suddenly, Brian's car was hit and dragged into a ravine. After that, his car was blown up, and the person who did this was Oleg's man. The people left, thinking that Brian was dead, but it turned out that Brian was still alive. Brian stopped a man passing by just to take a ride. When Brian saw the car that hit him was parked in a mini market, he immediately got down and went inside. Brian then slaughtered them all one by one. Brian asked one of Oleg's men about the person who sent them, but that person didn't want to say anything. Because he couldn't find any clues, Brian rushed to meet Stuart alone. He was sure that Stuart had something to do with all this problem. After hitting Stuart, Brian took him to a place to be interrogated. Because he was continuously tortured, finally Stuart said that it was Oleg Milankov who killed Lenore. Stuart had a huge debt to Oleg, so Oleg threatened to kill Stuart's family, including Lenore and Kim. They also knew Brian's toughness, so they deliberately trapped Brian so that he could be arrested by the police. After that, Brian took Stuart to his secret base. Sam and Kim were already there. Kim was very angry after finding out that her mother's death was because Stuart had been dealing with the Russian mafia. Brian asked Stuart to contact Oleg Milankov, pretending to want to pay his debt. Oleg then asked Stuart to come to his base. Before carrying out his mission, Brian asked about Oleg Milankov's identity. Stuart said that Oleg was a former Russian special soldier who served in a war zone. But one day, Oleg chose to retire from the military and slaughtered the Russian mafia to make himself the only mafia in power. Long story short, they headed to Oleg's place. There Stuart pretended to want to meet Oleg because he had an appointment. After the door opened, Brian came and knocked out the guards. Brian then came in, pretending to be Stuart, while Stuart himself returned to the car. After getting in, Brian finished them off. After winning the battle, Brian entered Oleg's room and Oleg immediately pointed his gun at Brian. Oleg didn't immediately finish off Brian and instead wanted to play with him first, so that Brian managed to get the opportunity to fight back, then shot Oleg. Brian asked why Oleg killed Lenore and also wanted to finish off his daughter, Kim. Hearing this, Oleg realized that he and Brian were manipulated by Stuart. Stuart deliberately sacrificed Lenore and his stepdaughter, so that Brian would be angry with Oleg, hoping that Brian could finish off Oleg and his group so that Stuart would be free from his debt. Now Stuart's cover has been blown, so he immediately shot Sam and kidnapped Kim. When he got there, Brian saw Sam was about to be taken to hospital. While Dotzler and his team had just arrived there, Brian stole a sports car to chase Stuart, who was kidnapping Kim. On the way, Dotzler contacted Brian and he said that the police had found a lot of evidence that Brian was innocent and would not be punished. But Dotzler asked Brian not to make a fuss and just leave the case to the police. Brian answered that Dotzler was working for his own career. Meanwhile, Brian was currently working for his daughter. Stuart had boarded a plane and was about to take off, but suddenly Brian came there. With a strong determination, Brian crashed his car into the wheels of the plane, so the plane failed to take off. Brian managed to shoot Stuart, then torturing him because Brian really wanted to finish him off. However, Kim forbade Brian to do that because if Brian did that, he would have destroyed the evidence and he would go to prison. In the end, Brian let Stuart to be arrested by the police. Before leaving, Brian promised Stuart that if Stuart was released from prison, he would look for him, then finish him off. 1 month later, Brian was with Kim and Jimmy. They really missed the cheerful Lenore, who really loved Kim. But after all, they still have to live their life.